Prepare to rethink everything you thought you knew. This is Mind Benders, your source for the most mind-twisting facts that will expand your understanding of the world. Let's bend some minds.
The hook and the enigma. What if I told you that the voice inside your head, that constant narrator of your life, the seed of your identity, your consciousness, is a modern invention? What if, for most of human history, our ancestors did not possess this internal monologue? They didn't weigh options, they didn't feel guilt, they didn't introspect. Instead, they walked the earth as biological automatons, guided by commands they heard as vividly as you are hearing my voice right now. And they believed these commands were the voices of gods. This isn't a thought experiment. It's a profound and unsettling possibility that strikes at the very core of what it means to be human. We assume consciousness is the defining, timeless trait of our species. But the ancient world has left behind a trail of baffling clues suggesting this is not the case. The oldest epics, the most sacred texts, the very structure of the first great civilizations all point to a radically different kind of mind. A mind that was not whole, a mind that was split in two. Consider Homer's Iliad, the bedrock of Western literature. Read it closely and you'll find something astonishingly strange. The characters, Achilles, Hector, Agamemnon, are not conscious in the way we are. They do not sit and ponder their next move. They have no inner world. When a difficult decision must be made, a voice simply appears. A god descends, or a goddess whispers in their ear and gives a direct, unambiguous command. The hero does not think, "I should do this." The hero hears a god say, "Do this," and then he obeys without question. The text doesn't say Achilles felt as though a god were speaking to him. It states, as a matter of fact, that the god was there. It wasn't metaphor, it was perception. For these ancient heroes, thought was not a private process of deliberation. It was a public act of divine communication. This isn't just a literary quirk. It's a pattern that repeats across the ancient world, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the early books of the Old Testament. A world filled with people who did not think for themselves. So, where did these voices come from? And, more importantly, where did they go? Part 2. The first clues emerge. In 1976, a Princeton psychologist and classicist named Julian Jaynes published a book that sent shockwaves through the intellectual world. It was called The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind. In it, he presented a theory so audacious, so contrary to our fundamental assumptions, that it remains one of the most controversial and mind-bending ideas ever proposed. Jaynes argued that until about 3,000 years ago, humanity operated with what he called a bicameral mind. The word bicameral simply means two chambers. His theory proposed that the human brain was literally organized into two parts. One part that made decisions and issued commands, and a second part that heard those commands and obeyed. Humans experienced these internally generated commands not as their own thoughts, but as external auditory hallucinations. The voices of dead ancestors, of the village chief, of the king, and ultimately the voice of God. According to Jaynes, this wasn't a flaw, it was the engine of civilization. How do you organize thousands of people to build pyramids, ziggurats, or complex irrigation systems in an age before widespread literacy and bureaucracy? You don't. A god does. The voice of God, speaking directly to the king or high priest, provided the unquestionable authority needed for mass social cohesion. Look at the evidence. The earliest civilizations were theocracies, ruled by god-kings who communicated directly with the divine. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe kings placing a special chair in their throne rooms for the god to sit in and offer counsel. They weren't being symbolic. They expected the god to actually sit there. God to speak. The world of the bicameral man was a world without introspection, without private identity, without guilt or doubt. It was a world of certainty, guided by an ever-present divine voice. They were not conscious beings wrestling with their place in the universe. They were integral parts of a larger divine plan, as a hand is an integral part of the body. They were the original humans, and we are their profoundly different descendants. But to understand how this mental model could have possibly worked, we have to look not just at history, but deep inside the architecture of the human brain itself. Deepening the paradox. The idea of a talking and a listening brain hemisphere might sound like science fiction, but it has a surprisingly firm grounding in neuroscience. Your brain is, of course, divided into two hemispheres, the left and the right, connected by a massive bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum. For most right-handed people, the left hemisphere is dominant for language, specifically an area called Wernicke's area, which is responsible for understanding speech, and Broca's area for producing it. This is the narrator part of our conscious brain. But what about the right hemisphere? It's more involved in pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and novel situations. Intriguingly, there is an area in the right hemisphere that corresponds directly to Wernicke's area in the left. In modern conscious humans, this area's function is less clearly defined, but Jaynes proposed a shocking role for it in our ancestors. This was the God part of the brain. This was the source of the voices. He theorized that in the bicameral mind, this right brain analog to the speech center would generate admonitory hallucinations, stress-induced commands, which would then travel across the corpus callosum to be heard by the language center in the left hemisphere as a foreign voice. It wasn't a god in the sky. It was a neurological process, a function of a brain wired differently from our own. Does any evidence for this remain? Jaynes pointed to a chilling modern parallel, schizophrenia. One of the primary symptoms of schizophrenia is experiencing auditory hallucinations, commanding voices that are perceived as completely external. Neuroimaging of schizophrenic patients during these episodes often shows a pattern of activity remarkably similar to Jaynes's theory. Heightened activity in the right temporal lobe, the very area he identified as the source of the God voice. He wasn't suggesting that ancient people were schizophrenic. Rather, he argued that schizophrenia and other phenomena like the inspiration of poets or the visions of mystics might be vestiges of this older mental structure, a cognitive architecture that our species has since abandoned, but whose ghostly echoes can still be heard in the margins of the human experience. The bicameral mind wasn't a disorder. It was the original operating system. Part 4. The world of the bicameral man. Let's step into this lost world. Imagine a society not governed by laws written on tablets, but by voices spoken into the minds of its people. Social control wasn't maintained by a police force, but by the ever-present internalized voice of authority, the king's voice, which was the God's voice. In this world, there is no need for a concept of a soul or an afterlife of the kind we imagine. When you died, you did not go anywhere. But your voice, the neurological record of your authority and wisdom, could live on, in the minds of your descendants. The voices of the recent dead would have been a primary source of guidance, a council of invisible elders. This is perhaps the origin of ancestor worship, not as a symbolic reverence, but a literal, ongoing conversation. What about free will? It simply wouldn't exist as a concept. A bicameral person would no more choose to disobey the voice of their God than your heart would choose to stop beating. Their actions would feel entirely natural, guided, and correct. The anxiety of choice, the burden of self, would be unknown. The idols and statues that fill the museums of the world take on a terrifying new meaning in this light. Jaynes argued these were not mere representations of the gods. They were psychosensory tools. An illiterate person needing guidance would go to the temple, stand before the idol of the God King, and the visual stimulus of the statue, perhaps aided by priests or acoustics, would help trigger the bicameral hallucination. The statue didn't just look like the god, it was the focal point through which the god spoke. Oracles and prophets weren't necessarily frauds. They may have been individuals with a particularly strong connection to their bicameral mind, able to summon the God voice more clearly than others. They were the loudspeakers for the divine. For thousands of years, this strange and seamless mental landscape was the foundation of human civilization. It built empires, created breathtaking art, and maintained a rigid, stable social order. But it was a fragile paradise, built on a delicate neurological balance. And around 1200 BCE, the world erupted into a cataclysm of chaos so profound that it would not just topple cities, but shatter the very mind of man. 5. The collapse and the birth of consciousness. So, what happened? If humanity lived for millennia in this state of divine guidance, what could possibly sever that connection? The answer, according to Jaynes, is one of the most mysterious and violent events in human history, the Bronze Age collapse. Between 1250 and 1150 BCE, nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East disintegrated. The great empires of the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Egyptians all fell into ruin. Cities were abandoned, trade routes vanished, and entire writing systems were lost forever. The cause is still debated by historians. A perfect storm of earthquakes, famine, mass migrations of the mysterious sea peoples, and systems collapse. In the stable world of the bicameral empires, the voices of the gods were consistent and reliable. But in this new world of unprecedented chaos, the old commands no longer worked. Imagine you are a bicameral farmer. The voice of your god tells you when to plant and when to harvest. But now invading armies are burning your fields. Your god is silent, or its commands lead to disaster. The voices, once a source of infallible guidance, become confused, contradictory, or fall silent altogether. The bicameral mind, a tool perfectly adapted for social stability, failed catastrophically under the stress of social collapse. Survival now depended on a new skill, the ability to navigate a novel situation without a divine command. The brain had to invent a new way to think, and it did so by creating a new kind of mental space. Instead of a god speaking to a man, the brain created an analog I that could speak to an analog me. It created an internal narrative. This was the birth of consciousness. It wasn't a glorious dawn. Jaynes argues it was a desperate, agonizing adaptation. The internal monologue, the voice in our head, is the ghost of the bicameral voice. We learned to talk to ourselves because the gods fell silent. We developed a narrative self, an identity, to make decisions in a world that was no longer predictable. The silent anxiety you feel when facing a difficult choice? That is the sound of a conscious mind at work, a mind that our ancient ancestors never possessed. This is the promised payoff, the core of the theory. Consciousness, the very thing we hold most dear about ourselves, was not an evolutionary gift. It was a scar. It was the frantic solution to the terror of divine abandonment, forged in the fires of a world falling apart. The profound conclusion. We are the children of the survivors. We are the descendants of those first, terrified humans who were forced to navigate the world without a divine guide. Our minds are fundamentally different from those who built the pyramids and wrote the first epics. We inherited this new cognitive tool, consciousness, a tool that allows us to lie, to create fictional futures, to feel guilt, to write poetry about our inner states, and to ask a question like, what am I? The evidence of this transition, Jaynes claims, is written across history. After the Bronze Age collapse, we see the emergence of new kinds of texts. We see the rise of the Hebrew prophets, not speaking as God, but pleading with God, arguing with him, a relationship impossible for a bicameral mind. We see the introspective Psalms, the personal reflections of Greek philosophers, and the emergence of law codes that assume individuals have free will and are responsible for their own actions. But the theory leaves us with a final, profound, and deeply unsettling thought. Are the vestiges of the bicameral mind truly gone, or do they linger? What is the passionate inspiration of an artist, the eureka moment of a scientist, or the deep intuitive feeling that guides a moral choice? What is prayer, if not a conscious attempt to elicit a response from that lost divine voice? Our modern world is saturated with attempts to find guidance, to connect with something larger than our own isolated consciousness. We seek it in religion, in ideologies, in charismatic leaders, in art, even in the algorithms that now tell us what to watch, buy, and believe. Is this modern yearning for purpose and direction simply nostalgia for a mind we have lost? A deep biological echo of a time when humanity was not alone in its own head? The bicameral mind theory proposes that the voice of God was never external. It was a neurological process, a function of our own brains. And for 3,000 years, we, the lonely conscious, have been trying to hear that voice again, forgetting that the silence we now inhabit is the very space that allows us to think for ourselves. The question then is not just where the voices of the gods went. The question is, what have we become in their absence?
The world is full of fascinating paradoxes, isn't it? We hope today's facts truly bent your mind. If you're ready for more daily revelations that challenge the norm, subscribe to Mindbenders. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new video. Until next time, keep questioning.